The Christmas Quilting Circle, a Miss Marple mystery. The quilt was not finished. That was the first thing Miss Marple noticed, when Hartley, the butler, a thin man with the permanently aggrieved expression of someone who had expected a better life, showed her into the quilting room on the afternoon of the 22nd. Before she noticed the bay windows banked with holly, before she noticed the great oak frame dominating the centre of the room like a dining table that had developed ambitions, before she even properly noticed the smell of the place. Beeswax and something faintly floral, lavender perhaps, and underneath both, the particular dry warmth of a room that had been closed too long. She noticed that the quilt on the frame was perhaps 2/3 done, and that 2/3 done in 4 days before Christmas was not, by any reasonable accounting, going to become finished. Mrs. Pembridge had said 6 days. She had written it in the letter, "We shall complete the charity quilt in 6 days, and I have every confidence in our little circle." And Miss Marple, who had known Dorothea Pembridge for 30-odd years, and knew her particular brand of confidence, had packed her wool and her needles and her warmest cardigan and come. She set her bag down and studied the frame. The work already done was beautiful. There was no other word for it. Lean quite close to confirm they were. In fact, hand-stitched and not machine-done. Mrs. Pembridge's section was identifiable immediately. The stitching ran right to left, each stitch pulling slightly tighter at the end of a row than the beginning, which gave the work a faint but characteristic tension. Like the woman herself, Miss Marple thought, always pulling tighter as things progressed. The unfinished portion gaped at the lower right, a rough rectangle of batting exposed, the backing fabric pinned but unstitched, 2 completed squares waiting to be joined to their neighbours. Someone had begun a 3rd square and abandoned it mid-row. "The other ladies arrive tomorrow," Hartley said from the doorway, having apparently decided that additional information was owed. "Miss Trevelyan and Mrs. Bott. Mrs. Pembridge is dressing for dinner. She asks if you'll take sherry in the drawing-room at 6:30. How very kind! And Mr. Fenwick, is he already here?" A fractional pause. "Mr. Fenwick arrived yesterday, miss. And Colonel Bassett. And Miss Hartwell. Miss Hartwell, that's the niece?" "Yes, miss." He withdrew. Miss Marple stood a moment longer at the quilt frame, one hand resting very lightly on the finished portion. The fabric was cool and smooth under her fingers, dense with the slight raised texture of hand-stitching. And then she went to dress for dinner. Greenhollow Manor in December had the particular quality of a house that was trying very hard. The holly was abundant, the candles numerous, and someone, almost certainly not Mrs. Pembridge herself, who had strong views about excess, had wound ivy around the banister with an enthusiasm that would make dusting it afterward a small nightmare. The drawing-room fire was enormous, and the sherry was excellent. And the 5 people standing in it with their glasses had the look, Miss Marple thought, of guests at a party who had each independently received bad news that morning, and were determined not to mention it. Mrs. Pembridge herself was the exception. She was 70, or near it, and carried the age the way certain women did, not gracefully, exactly, but with authority, as though age were a garment she had chosen and found satisfactory. Her hands, wrapping the sherry glass, were broad and roughened in a way that her rings could not quite disguise. Working hands, Miss Marple had always thought, on a woman who had never needed to work. She simply liked to. The lavender water was as Miss Marple remembered, generous, a little old-fashioned, unmistakable. Jane, she crossed the room with the decisive step of a woman who had decided where she was going well before she moved. "Oh, you look extremely well. I look exactly as I always do," said Miss Marple, "which is to say old, but how kind." Mrs. Pembridge laughed. A real laugh, not a social one. Whatever troubles the house contained, she was, in this moment, genuinely pleased to have a friend in it. The others were introduced. Colonel Bassett was a large red-faced man with a white moustache, and the slightly overloud voice of someone filling a silence he found uncomfortable. And he told 2 anecdotes about India before the sherry was half finished. Agnes Hartwell, the niece, was perhaps 29, pretty in an unassertive way, with the kind of stillness that Miss Marple had learned, over many years, to distinguish carefully from calm. This was not calm. This was someone holding themselves very carefully together, the way one held a cracked cup, functional but aware of the crack. And Thomas Fenwick. He was 50-odd, lean, as with the careful grooming of a professional man, and the careful manner of one too, pleasant, precise, unremarkable. He asked Miss Marple about her journey. He admired the holly arrangement. He refilled Colonel Bassett's glass without being asked, which was either courtesy or a desire to keep the Colonel talking so that no one else need. What he did not do, and this Miss Marple noted, not with any particular alarm, simply as a fact to be placed beside other facts, was look at Mrs. Pembridge with anything approaching the warmth or ease of a man who had managed her legal affairs for 11 years and been trusted entirely. He looked at her the way one looks at a thread that has begun to pull loose from a garment. Watchful, calculating the damage. Mrs. Pembridge noticed none of this, or appeared not to. Agnes Hartwell noticed Miss Marple noticing, and looked quickly away. Dinner was lamb, and then a very good trifle, and the conversation covered the weather, worsening, and the charity the quilt was intended for, a children's home in Swindon, and Colonel Bassett's views on modern architecture, unfavourable. Fenwick contributed carefully to each topic. Agnes said very little. Twice Miss Marple caught her glancing at her aunt with an expression that had something painful in it. Not guilt, not quite, but the particular anguish of someone who wishes very much. They had said a thing they have not yet said. After dinner, returning to her room, Miss Marple passed the small writing room at the end of the east corridor, and saw, through the half-open door, that the light was on. A figure at the desk, Agnes she thought, though she could only see the back, and on the desk a letter, not being written, being read or reread. The shoulders were rigid. Miss Marple did not slow her pace, but she thought about those shoulders for quite some time before she slept. Miss Trevelyan and Mrs. Bott arrived the following morning in a hired car that had clearly not been designed with luggage in mind, judging by the quantity of it that had to be extracted from improbable places. Miss Trevelyan was 73, angular, and carried her knitting bag as other women carried handbags, at all times with complete unconscious authority. Mrs. Bott was younger by a decade, rounder by considerable measure, and brought with her a tin of shortbread and the news, delivered within 4 minutes of entering the hall, that the roads north of Chipping Ashford were already bad, and the weather forecast was not encouraging. "Snow by tonight," she said, unwinding a scarf of remarkable length. "Possibly before." "How very festive," said Miss Marple. "How very inconvenient," said Mrs. Pembridge. but she said it with the tone of a woman who has already accommodated the inconvenience into her plans and found it manageable. And they gathered in the quilting room after elevenses, the 5 women of the circle, with the quilt frame between them like a shared problem. And for an hour or so, the house was exactly what it was supposed to be. Needles moving, thread pulled through in the particular small rhythm of hand quilting, which Miss Marple had always found more soothing than almost anything else she knew. Conversation drifting from topic to topic without urgency. Mrs. Bott's shortbread on a plate to one side. Mrs. Pembridge worked at the lower right section, the unfinished portion, with the focused economy of someone who has been sewing since childhood and no longer needs to think about it. Right to left, each stitch tighter at the row's end, precise. On the side table beside her chair, a small glass of elderberry cordial, deep reddish purple, viscous, smelling of something between jam and medicine. No one else had one. Hartley had brought it without being asked. "Your cordial habit," Miss Trevelyan said, in the mildly reproving tone she reserved for habits she considered eccentric. Every year, Mrs. Pembridge agreed, untroubled. My mother drank it, her mother before her. I find it settles the stomach after a morning's work. She took a small sip, set the glass precisely back on its mat, and returned to her stitching. Miss Marple watched this. Then she watched Thomas Fenwick, who had appeared in the doorway at 11:30 with some papers requiring Mrs. Pembridge's signature, and had stayed, rather than going, after the papers were dealt with, settling himself in the chair by the window with a book he did not appear to be reading. He was watching the cordial, not constantly, not in any way that would catch the attention of someone not specifically looking for it. But each time Mrs. Pembridge reached for the glass, his eyes went to it, briefly, precisely, and then away. Miss Marple said nothing. She stitched her section of a green square and thought about the solicitor in St. Mary Mead. Old Mr. Trelawney's man, what was his name? Hawkins Hodgson, who had borrowed small amounts from the widow's account for 20 years, and been caught only because the widow's granddaughter had come to stay and noticed that the household bills seemed rather large for one person, and the granddaughter had been 22 and thought nothing of asking a direct question. The solicitor had been 61 and thought he had been very careful indeed. He had not been careful enough. They so rarely were, Miss Marple thought. The mistake was always the same. They forgot that someone might be watching them watch. It was Agnes who found her. 8:30 that evening, the quilting room empty of everyone else, the fire banked low. Agnes had gone to fetch her aunt for dinner and found the door ajar, which was not unusual, and the room quiet, which was also not unusual, and Mrs. Pembridge slumped forward over the quilt frame, which was not right at all. The sound Agnes made brought Hartley first, then Colonel Bassett at a run, then everyone else in a ragged sequence. Miss Marple came last, unhurried, and stood in the doorway for a moment before entering. Mrs. Pembridge was quite dead. She was forward over the frame, her broad hands still near her work, her face turned to the right, her cheek against the quilt's surface, and the elderberry cordial glass stood on the side table. It was nearly empty. The doctor, summoned from Chipping Ashford in the teeth of the worsening weather, arrived at 10:30, examined the body, noted the cordial, noted the history of a heart condition that Miss Marple had not previously known about, and pronounced it cardiac arrest. Natural causes, regrettable at Christmas, and he was kind but efficient, and by 11 o'clock he was gone again, back into the snow. Colonel Bassett accepted brandy and said it was a dreadful business. Agnes sat in the corner of the drawing-room, with her hands in her lap and her face entirely empty, the way faces went when the mind behind them was working very hard on something it had not yet resolved. Fenwick spoke quietly to Hartley about practical arrangements, his voice measured and appropriate, and, to Miss Marple, he standing near the fire with her untouched sherry, quite without the quality that grief lent to voices when it was genuine. She had a heart condition, Colonel Bassett said to no one in particular. One knew she wasn't strong. One knew no such thing, said Miss Marple pleasantly. Bassett looked at her. I beg your pardon? Dorothea Pembridge walked 4 miles every morning until September. She had strong opinions, a strong constitution, and strong views about people who made assumptions about her health. She smiled at him, entirely without sharpness. She had an irregular heartbeat, which is not the same thing as not being strong, but you're quite right that it's dreadful, at Christmas especially. She took a sip of her sherry and looked at the window. Outside, the snow was coming down in earnest now. It had covered the drive completely. The road beyond the gates was invisible, and the sky was the particular dark cream colour of a sky, with considerably more snow still in it, and the wind had begun to make itself known against the glass. They were, all of them, going nowhere. She slept badly, not from distress exactly, but from the particular restless attention that came over her when things were not adding up. The cordial glass on the wrong side of the frame, that had been the first thing. Mrs. Pembridge was right-handed, stitched right to left. He kept everything on her right, her scissors, her thimble tin, her glass. The cordial had been on her left when they found her. Small things, possibly nothing. She thought about Agnes in the writing-room, reading that letter with rigid shoulders. She thought about Fenwick's eyes going to the cordial glass. She thought about the quilt, the unfinished lower right section, the exposed batting, the pinned but unstitched backing, and how Mrs. Pembridge had been working precisely there when she died. At 2 in the morning, Miss Marple got up, put on her dressing-gown and her warmest slippers, and went quietly down the east corridor toward the quilting room. The door was closed. She tried the handle. Locked. That was new. There had been no lock turned on this room since she arrived. She stood in the corridor for a moment, her hand still on the cold brass handle, and listened. The house was entirely silent except for the wind and the occasional soft percussion of snow against glass. No footsteps, no voices. She went back to bed. But she lay awake for a long time, her hands still against the counterpane, the cotton cool and slightly rough under her fingers, and thought about locks, and about what it meant when someone locked a door in the small hours of the morning, and about the particular species of person who moved through the world trusting that no one was watching them. They were always wrong about that in the end. Always. The morning was white and absolute. Miss Marple stood at her bedroom window at 7 and looked out at a world that had been simplified overnight. The formal garden gone, the drive gone, the gateposts reduced to 2 rounded suggestions, the whole landscape pressed flat and featureless under 8 or 9 inches of snow, with more coming steadily down. A blackbird sat on the windowsill for a moment, regarded her with the frank hostility of a creature that has been inconvenienced by the weather and considers it personal, and then departed. Hartley confirmed at breakfast that the road was impassable. The telephone line to the village was working, intermittently, and he had spoken to the local constable, a Sergeant Hooper, apparently, of limited enthusiasm, who had said he would come when the roads permitted and not before. The doctor's verdict stood. There was no reason, Sergeant Hooper had implied, to treat the death of an elderly woman with a known heart condition as anything other than what the doctor had called it. Miss Marple ate her toast and said nothing. The quilting room was unlocked again in the morning. Hartley opened it himself when she asked, producing the key from his ring without comment. And if he noticed anything unusual about being asked for it, he gave no sign. Miss Marple went in alone, on the pretext of wishing to sit quietly. Ian spent 20 minutes at the frame before anyone else appeared. The lower right section, where Mrs. Pembridge had been working, had been disturbed. Not grossly. Not in a way that would announce itself to anyone who had not been studying this quilt with the particular attention Miss Marple had given it yesterday. But one panel, a 6-inch square of deep green, third from the right in the bottom row, had been restitched, and she could see it plainly when she looked. The thread colour was a fraction lighter than the surrounding work, and the stitch direction ran left to right, not right to left, not Mrs. Pembridge's direction. Someone else's hands had been in this quilt. She pressed the panel very gently with 2 fingers. It was slightly thicker than it should be, slightly more resistant, as though the batting beneath had been disturbed and replaced, or as though something had been added to it, and she did not unpick it. Not yet, not here, with the house awake around her and footsteps audible in the corridor. She smoothed the panel back, straightened, and was examining a perfectly innocuous section of red squares near the top when Agnes Hartwell appeared in the doorway. The girl looked as though she had not slept at all. Her hair was neat, she had made that effort, but her eyes had the bruised, scraped quality of genuine sleeplessness. And her hands, wanted us to finish it. Yes, said Miss wanted us to finish it. Yes, said Miss Marple. I rather think she would. Come and sit down, dear. Agnes came and sat, not at the frame, but in the chair beside the cold fireplace, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Miss Marple picked up her needle and made a small pretence of working. You're not going to ask me, Agnes said finally. Yeah, ask you what? What everyone is thinking. What they were all thinking at dinner last night, even if no one said it. Her voice was steady, but only just, the steadiness of someone gripping a thing very hard. About the will, about the fact that I was going to be cut out of it. Were you? Agnes looked at her. You didn't know. I knew you were unhappy about something involving your aunt. I suspected it was financial, because money is the most common reason for that particular expression. I didn't know the specifics. She found out about David. Agnes's hands came together in her lap, fingers pressing against fingers. My husband. We married in September, quietly, without telling anyone, because I knew she would object. His family isn't. She considered them unsuitable. She found out 3 weeks ago. She wrote to me. A pause. The letter I had at dinner, the first night. She said she was changing the will, that she would speak to Mr. Fenwick about it over Christmas. And Mr. Fenwick knew this? Agnes looked up sharply. She told him, yes, last week apparently. He handles everything, handled all her legal affairs. Miss Marple's needles were still. She looked mildly at the green square. And how did Mr. Fenwick seem when you spoke with him after your aunt's death? Seem? His manner? Was he distressed? Agnes considered this with the serious attention of someone who had not previously thought to consider it. He was very correct, very proper. He said all the right things. She paused again. He didn't cry, but men don't always, I suppose. No, said Miss Marple, they don't always. She found Colonel Bassett in the library after lunch, standing at the window with his hands clasped behind his back, and the rigid posture of a man practicing composure in private. He turned when she entered, with the slight overcorrection of someone caught in an unguarded moment. Miss Marple, looking for a book? Looking for company, she said, which was not entirely untrue. These quiet days after a death, one doesn't quite know what to do with oneself. He relaxed marginally. This was a sentiment he understood. Dreadful business, he said, for what Miss Marple counted as the 4th time since last evening. You'd known her long. 20 years, more perhaps, met through mutual friends. He turned back to the window. The snow was still coming. She was a remarkable woman. Difficult, but remarkable. The two often go together. Miss Marple settled into the nearest chair. I believe she was very good about financial matters, kept things carefully managed. A beat, small, but there. Extremely, Bassett said to the window. One does appreciate that in a person, especially when one has arrangements of a financial nature with them. She paused. Loans, for instance, that sort of thing. His shoulders, already straight, went straighter. I don't know what you— I only mean, Miss Marple said in her most comfortable voice, that it must be a relief in a way when one's creditor dies. I don't mean that unkindly. Simply that, Colonel, forgive me, £2,000 is a significant sum, and an informal loan between friends is a difficult thing to have hanging over one at Christmas. The silence was quite long. Outside, the wind pushed a sheet of snow against the glass. How do you know about that? He said. Pembridge mentioned it to me some years ago. Not unkindly. She was not unkind about it. She simply said you'd had a bad run of luck, and she'd helped where she could. Miss Marple's expression was entirely sympathetic. I imagine her death creates its own complications, of course, depending on what the will says, whether the debt was formally recorded. Bassett turned from the window. His face was complicated, relief and shame and something rawer than either. It was not formally recorded, he said. It was between friends. Then I imagine it dies with her. Miss Marple stood. How fortunate! She said it gently. She meant it as a release. But she watched his face as she said it, and what she saw there was not the expression of a man who had committed murder. That particular quality of careful blankness over deep calculation, but the far more ordinary expression of a man who was ashamed of being relieved. Colonel Bassett had not killed Dorothea Pembridge. He had simply owed her money and was now, in his complicated, blustering, not entirely bad heart, sorry and grateful in equal measure. Thomas Fenwick she did not seek out. He came to her. Late afternoon, the light already failing, the drawing-room empty of everyone else. She had chosen her moment, and apparently so had he. He brought tea on the pretext of asking if she needed anything, set it down on the table beside her chair, and stood for a moment with the pleasant professional manner of a man doing a kindness. You must be tired, Miss Marple. It's been a difficult 2 days. Oh, one manages, she said. At my age, one has seen a great deal of difficulty. One develops resources. Quite, he smiled. I wonder, did Mrs. Pembridge ever mention me to you? In her letters, perhaps, or when you'd spoken. Careful. She spoke of you as she spoke of all her professional people, Miss Marple said pleasantly. Or with confidence. Something moved behind his eyes. There and gone. She was very kind, he straightened. Well, I'll leave you to your tea. He left. Miss Marple looked at the tea. Then she lifted the cup and held it close, not drinking, simply holding it near enough to notice. The steam carried the right smell. The colour was right, but there was something underneath. Faint, strangely sweet, not quite right in the way that a hem slightly out of line was not quite right. For a moment, her hands in her lap. The cold brass of her thimble pressing against her palm. Then she took out her knitting and began to work and waited for Hartley to come and clear the tea things. The thread of it was becoming clear now. Horribly, plainly clear. She found Lily in the linen cupboard, and this was not as strange as it sounds. Lily Foss, the housemaid, was 17, and had the instinct of someone who, when the household above stairs became difficult, retreated to the below-stairs equivalent of a foxhole. The linen cupboard was warm, smelled of clean cotton and cedar, and had the considerable advantage of a small stool wedged between the shelves that Lily had clearly been using for some time. She scrambled up when Miss Marple appeared in the doorway, a linen pillowcase in hand, as evidence of legitimate purpose. "Don't trouble yourself," said Miss Marple. "I only want to ask you something. Sit down, dear." Lily sat cautiously. "The night before last, the night Mrs. Pembridge died, did you go into the quilting room at any point after dinner?" The girl's hands tightened on the pillowcase. "I took in the extra coal at 7:30. Mrs. Pembridge liked the fire kept up when she was working late." "Yes. And was anyone else in the room then, or nearby?" A pause, the particular pause of someone deciding whether telling the truth will make things better or considerably worse. Mr. Fenwick was in the corridor, coming away from the quilting room. She hesitated. He had something in his hand, a small tin, like a sewing tin, the kind with the sliding lid. I noticed it because it seemed, I don't know. He doesn't sew. "No," said Miss Marple, "he doesn't. He said he'd been returning something to the room that Mrs. Pembridge had left in the library. He smiled at me. He seemed very ordinary about it." Lily's voice had the slight uncertainty of someone revising a memory in light of new information. "I didn't think anything of it at the time." "Of course you didn't. There was no reason to." Miss Marple patted the girl's hand once, briskly. "Now, the following morning, the morning after Mrs. Pembridge was found, did you take tea to the drawing-room in the afternoon? It would take Miss Marple's tea through himself, as he was passing." A beat. Was there something wrong with the tea? "The tea was perfectly fine," said Miss Marple, with complete serenity. "Thank you, Lily. You've been very helpful. And I'd be grateful if you didn't mention this conversation to anyone just yet." She left the girl with her pillowcase and her expression of complicated unease, and went directly to the quilting room. She worked quickly and without hesitation. The room was empty. The other ladies had abandoned the quilt for the afternoon, the death of their hostess having rather taken the heart from communal needlework, and Miss Marple drew the door nearly closed behind her, settled herself at the frame, and put her fingers on the third green square in the bottom row. Left to right stitching, slightly thicker. Wrong. She had brought her own small scissors, the silver ones shaped like a stalk, that had been her aunt's, and were still the sharpest thing she owned, and she began, with great care, to unpick the stitching along the panel's edge. 4 sides. The thread came away cleanly, the colour slightly too pale against the green, and she noted this with a grim precision before setting it aside, as she pressed the panel open. Folded into the batting, pressed flat, creased tight, invisible unless the panel was fully opened, was a piece of paper. Not large, folded twice. She lifted it out with 2 careful fingers, set it on the arm of the nearest chair and unfolded it. Mrs. Pembridge's handwriting. She knew it from 30 years of Christmas cards and occasional letters, upright, slightly impatient, never quite fitting the lines of the page. T.F. He has been taking money from the estate accounts since at minimum 1947. I have found discrepancies in 3 years of accounts, 1951, 1952, 1953, and have reason to believe the forgeries go back further. The documents in the Oak Bureau in the library have been altered. I intend to present this to the authorities on Christmas Day, having first given T.F. the opportunity to confess privately. If anything happens to me before that date, this note should serve as explanation. D.P. December 20th. Miss Marple read it twice. Then she folded it again, precisely along its original creases, and placed it inside her cardigan, against the wool, close against her, where it would stay until she needed it. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap. Outside, the snow had finally stopped. The silence it left behind was immense, the deep-pressed silence of a landscape under several feet of snow, a silence that made the house seem very small and very isolated, which it was. Everyone still here. No one going anywhere before morning at the earliest. The roads might clear by Christmas Eve. Might not. She thought about Dorothea Pembridge writing that note on the 20th, 2 days before the quilting circle arrived, and hiding it in the quilt of all places. Hiding it in the work that would continue after her, that would be finished by her friends, that would be examined square by square in the natural course of completion. She had hidden it where it would be found, is eventually by the right kind of people. She had hidden it where a solicitor would not think to look, because a solicitor, this solicitor, would not think that women who quilt were paying attention. That was Dorothea exactly. Even the hiding place was precise. She heard him coming. Not his footsteps, the corridor carpet absorbed those, but the particular slight sound of the door handle being tried very gently before being pressed, the sound of a man checking whether a room was occupied before committing to entry. Miss Marple had her knitting out and her hands moving before the door fully opened. Fenwick stood in the doorway. He looked at her. She looked at her knitting. "Miss Marple?" His voice was even. "I didn't realize anyone was in here." "I find it peaceful," she said. "One gets rather in the way at times like these. Too many people in the drawing-room." She smiled up at him. "Were you looking for something?" The pause was very brief. "I thought I might have left my fountain pen in here yesterday. I haven't seen a pen." She gestured vaguely at the frame. "Do look, by all means." He came in. He looked, not for a pen, she noted, but at the quilt, at the bottom row, at the third green square. His face did not change, but something in his posture did. The shoulders dropped a quarter inch, the neck lengthened slightly, and the whole body making the minute adjustment of a man who has confirmed something he needed to confirm. The panel looked undisturbed. She had repinned it with great care. "Not there, I'm afraid," he said. "Perhaps the library," Miss Marple offered. I believe you spent some time there yesterday afternoon." He looked at her then, really looked, for the first time since she had arrived at Greenhollow. Not the professional, pleasant assessment of a man managing an elderly house-guest, but something sharper, something that was taking her measure in a way she recognized. "Yes," he said, "perhaps the library." He left. Miss Marple counted to 30, slowly, evenly, before her hands stopped moving. He had poisoned his employer of 11 years, and then hidden the evidence in a dead woman's needlework. And now he was in this house with her. And with Agnes, and with the note folded against her ribs. And the roads were still closed. The thing was not to appear to know. Not yet, and not until tomorrow evening, when the roads might be passable, and a telephone call to Sergeant Hooper might produce rather more urgency than it had 2 days ago. Not until she had spoken to Agnes, quietly, carefully, because the girl needed to know she was not suspected, needed to know that someone in this house was on her side entirely and without reservation. The thread had to be pulled all the way through before you cut it. That was the rule of good needlework. A pulling too soon left loose ends. She would not pull too soon. She found Agnes before dinner, in the small sitting room off the hall, and sat beside her on the window seat without preamble. "I want you to listen to me carefully," she said in a voice pitched for Agnes alone. "You did not kill your aunt. I know this, and I intend to make sure everyone else knows it by tomorrow evening. But I need you to do something for me between now and then." Agnes stared at her. "What?" "Be ordinary," said Miss Marple. "At dinner, be perfectly ordinary. Don't avoid Mr. Fenwick. Don't seek him out. Don't mention the will, the letter, or David. Simply be a niece at Christmas grieving her aunt. Can you do that?" A long pause. Agnes Hartley looked at her with the expression of someone who has been very frightened for 2 days, and has just been, unexpectedly, handed something solid to hold. "Yes," she said, "I can do that." "Good girl," said Miss Marple. The Christmas Eve arrived with cold, clear light. The snow had stopped in the night, and the sky had gone to that particular hard blue that follows heavy snowfall. Brittle, brilliant, unforgiving. By 9 in the morning, Hartley had confirmed that the main road was passable, that Sergeant Hooper had been telephoned, and that the sergeant and a colleague from Chipping Ashford would arrive by early afternoon. Miss Marple received this information over her breakfast toast, thanked him, and asked that the household be gathered in the drawing-room at 2:30. Hartley looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating something. "Yes, miss," he said. They assembled with the collective unease of people who have been told to gather without being told why. Colonel Bassett with his bluster slightly diminished, like a fire running low on fuel. Mrs. Bott and Miss Trevelyan side by side on the sofa, knitting bags in hand as armour or comfort or both. Agnes in the chair nearest the door, her back straight, her hands in her lap, being perfectly ordinary as instructed. Fenwick by the window. Standing, not sitting, which Miss Marple noted, because standing was the position of a man who had not yet decided whether he would need to leave quickly. Miss Marple stood before the fireplace. She had not dressed differently for this. She was in her usual grey cardigan, her usual sensible shoes, her hair pinned as it always was. She held nothing, and the note was in her cardigan pocket, the silver scissors in the other, and her hands were free. She did not clear her throat. She did not begin with an apology for the intrusion, or a qualification about her own limitations. She was not this afternoon the vague and gentle elderly lady that people found easy to overlook. Dorothea Pembridge was murdered, she said. She was poisoned with something introduced into her elderberry cordial on the evening of the 22nd. The doctor was not wrong about her heart. She did have a weakness there, but the weakness was assisted, considerably. Bassett made a sound. Mrs. Bott's needles stopped. She was not killed for her money, not directly. She was killed because she had discovered that her estate solicitor, Mr. Fenwick, had been stealing from her accounts for at minimum 11 years, and she intended to expose him on Christmas Day. Miss Marple's eyes moved to Fenwick and stayed there. She gave him notice of her intentions, which gave him time to act. Fenwick's face was a professional face. Composed, attentive, the face of a man hearing an interesting theory. "Miss Marple," he said with measured patience, "this is a very serious accusation." "Yes, it is." She reached into her pocket and produced the note. "Mrs. Pembridge wrote this on the 20th of December, 2 days before we arrived." She hid it in the quilt, in a panel in the lower right section, behind the batting, because she was, I think, a woman who trusted her own instincts about danger and wanted a record to exist somewhere safe. She held it up. She names you specifically, Mr. Fenwick. She describes the forged documents. She describes 3 years of accounts in which the discrepancies are, she says, findable. I imagine the police will find them very easily once they know where to look. "A piece of paper," Fenwick said. "Her handwriting, you say, unwitnessed, is written by a woman with a heart condition, possibly under stress or confusion." "She was not confused," Agnes said from her chair. Her voice was quiet and absolutely firm. "She was never confused." Fenwick glanced at her, then back at Miss Marple. "You hid something else in that quilt," Miss Marple continued. "After she died, you went into the quilting room. Lily saw you, coming away from it carrying a sewing tin, and you restitched that panel to hide the note, and not knowing it was already there. You thought you were concealing evidence. You were, in fact, creating it." She paused. "The stitching runs left to right. Mrs. Pembridge always stitched right to left. I noticed her direction on the first afternoon. The restitched panel is not her work, it is yours. And it is the wrong colour thread and the wrong tension. And to anyone who has spent 60 years with a needle, it is as clear as a signature." The room was very still. "You also," she said, "put something in my tea on the afternoon of the 23rd. Lily confirms she did not bring my tray. You did. Whatever you used, it was not subtle enough. Or perhaps I am simply old enough that strange tastes in tea attract my attention rather than escaping it. I set the cup aside. I didn't mention it at the time because I was not yet ready." She looked at him steadily. "I am ready now." Fenwick stood at the window with the hard blue sky behind him and said nothing for a long moment. His hands, those two still hands, were in his jacket pockets. The professional composure was still in place, but it had the quality now of a wall with water behind it, holding but only just, and only because he was pressing against it from the inside with everything he had. "You cannot prove the cordial," he said. "Whatever was in it is gone. There is no analysis, no sample, no evidence of poison beyond an old woman's handwriting and a piece of badly stitched quilt." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "not alone. But there is the note. And there are 11 years of fraudulent accounts. And there is Lily's testimony about the sewing tin. And there is the matter of my tea, which I am quite prepared to describe in detail to the police. And there is Agnes." She turned briefly toward the girl. "Who can describe the letter she received? The conversation her aunt had with you about the will change, and the precise sequence of your manner and movements since Mrs. Pembridge died." She turned back to him. "Taken together, Mr. Fenwick, these things make a weight that I believe a jury will find considerable." The wall came down. Not dramatically. Not with the collapse of a man in a story, weeping or raging or lunging for the door. It came down the way exhausted things come down. Quietly, all at once, without struggle. His shoulders dropped. His hands came out of his pockets. He looked for the first time since Miss Marple had arrived at Greenhollow, like what he actually was, a frightened man who had done a terrible thing and had been running from it in one way or another for 11 years before it finally ran him down. "She was going to destroy me," he said. "Not to the room, not to anyone in particular." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "she was. Everything I had, my practice, my reputation. I have a daughter. She's 18. I have—" He stopped. "I know," said Miss Marple. And she did know. It did not excuse it, nothing excused it, but she understood the exact shape of it, the way fear and greed and the original small theft compound over years into something monstrous precisely because each step seems like only the next step. She had seen it before. She had seen it in St. Mary Mead with Hodson. That was his name, Hodson. And she had seen it in cases far beyond St. Mary Mead, and it was always the same terrible arithmetic of people who borrowed against a future they could not guarantee. Understanding it did not move her. "I know," she said again, "but she is dead, Mr. Fenwick, and she deserved not to be." Sergeant Hooper arrived at 3 o'clock with a colleague, and a manner that had upgraded itself considerably from the telephone call of 2 days prior. Miss Marple gave him the note, described the quilt panel, summarized Lily's account and the matter of the tea with the brisk efficiency of someone who has done this before and sees no reason for theatre. Fenwick went with them without resistance, his coat on, his face closed. He did not look at Agnes as he passed her. Agnes watched him go. She did not cry. At 4 o'clock, in the last of the Christmas Eve light, the remaining members of the St. Mary Mead Quilting Circle gathered around the frame for the last time. The work went quickly, and there was something in the silence of it, not oppressive, not forced, simply the natural quiet of women who have known each other a long time and do not need to fill every space with words, that made the final hour of stitching feel like the right ending to a wrong week. Mrs. Bott took the left side, Miss Trevelyan the right. Agnes, at Miss Marple's gentle direction, took the lower row, working over and around the restitched panel that had held her aunt's last testimony, which was now folded into an evidence envelope in Sergeant Hooper's breast pocket. Miss Marple took the final square. It was a small piece, a 4-inch block of deep Christmas red, the last in the sequence, positioned at the lower right corner where the quilt ended. She threaded her needle with the same colour the rest of the square demanded, pulled the first stitch through, and worked, right to left, the right tension, the right hands. The sky had gone from hard blue to the sky had gone from hard blue to the deep soft violet of a Christmas Eve that intended to be cold and clear and full of stars. Agnes had telephoned David from the hall telephone 20 minutes ago, her voice dropping to something private and relieved that Miss Marple had not tried to hear. The Colonel Bassett was in the library with a whisky and a complicated expression. Hartley was managing, as Hartley managed everything, with aggrieved competence. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap and looked at the finished quilt. Every square accounted for, every thread pulled through and knotted. The evidence in the right hands, the innocent girl safe, the roads open, Christmas coming in a matter of hours. It was not a happy ending exactly. It was simply the correct one. The one the facts demanded. The one Dorothea Pembridge had, with considerable foresight and a hidden note and 30 years of friendship, helped to bring about from beyond the reach of anyone who had underestimated her. Which was, Miss Marple thought, very like her indeed.